Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Sunday. Welcome and thank you for attending today's Town Hall Gender 101. My name is Megan Goebel, the founder of Unity Conejo, and I'm so happy you're here. If you've been following us on social media for a while, you will likely notice that today's Town Hall was originally supposed to be dispelling the myths of gender ed for grades K through 5. However, after much discussion, we have decided to flip these next two events as it just makes better sense overall to actually explain gender before we try and dispel the myths around it. That said, whether this discussion today impacts yourself, someone you love, or you're just hoping to understand more, we hope you'll leave today's presentation feeling more informed and sympathetic to the importance of inclusion. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. Some of you have submitted questions prior to today's town hall, and we will answer as many of those as we can, time allowing. If at any time during this panel you have a question or a comment that you would like to make, please do so in the question and answer chat box below at the bottom of your screen. Please be mindful that these questions come straight to us, so no one else will see them. Attendees can choose to pose their questions anonymously. You can click a box in there to do that. If we run out of time and cannot answer all of the questions that have been asked, we will combine them into a document and send them out after the event via email. Please note also that this webinar is being recorded. And now, with further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce to you our presenter and special guest today, Dr. Jessica Bernacki, Ph.D. Dr. Bernacki is the founding psychologist for the UCLA Gender Health Program and has a private practice here in Thousand Oaks. She provides consultation, assessment, and psychotherapy to gender diverse individuals of all ages. Her areas of interest include gender affirmative care, the delivery of evidence-based behavioral health services in medical settings, and supporting adolescents and young adults with the transition from pediatric to adult care. Dr. Bernacki, we're so fortunate to have you here with us today. Welcome.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so let's go ahead and share your screen here so that we can see this slide deck. Awesome.
Is that working?
It is.
All right, awesome. So, there we go. I think I got it. All right. So today, as Megan mentioned, I'm going to be talking about kind of Gender 101. And a good place to start is always terminology. So, when we're talking about the concept of gender, we're talking about a person's internal sense of themselves. We tend to think of this as male, female, girl, boy, but we actually know that there are many, many other genders than just those. And so it's really just a person's internal sense of themselves. Gender expression is actually how a person displays their gender outwardly, kind of to others. Sex, this is, the term is, someone's sex assigned at birth. This is what we will label a person, when they're born, typically based on things like their chromosomes or their genitalia. So, individuals when they're born will typically have, boy or male or female or intersex listed on their birth certificate. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about sex. The term cisgender is the term for someone whose gender matches their sex assigned at birth, whereas transgender is the umbrella term for individuals whose gender differs from their sex assigned at birth. The term non-binary is one umbrella term for individuals whose gender is not exclusively binary, so not male or female. Individuals who are non-binary may feel like they are, neither gender or both genders, or, something even in between, or something altogether different. The term transition, which we're going to talk a lot more about as we go along, is the process by which an individual moves towards congruence with their gender. We'll talk a little bit about what that means as we go along. There's a much longer and more thorough terminology list available through the website provided here. And I believe we will be providing a list of some of these resources as well in some of the materials we sent along afterwards.
Absolutely.
So you'll get the links. I would like to start off also by sharing that I really work from a gender affirmative model, as Megan mentioned. And it's really kind of the evidence-based approach we know of for working with supporting people with exploring their gender. So the gender affirmative model has some basic kind of assumptions or kind of tenets. And the first is that no gender or expression is pathological, recognizes that gender presentations are diverse. When we talk about gender, the gender involves integrating biology, development, socialization, culture, and context. The gender can be fluid, is not inherently binary, and can change over time. And that any pathology that may be present is often caused by cultural reactions to gender diversity rather than internal psychological disturbances. So there's nothing inherently pathological about having a transgender identity. It's more often, existing in a society that may not be accepting of that leads to problems, which we'll talk about. And really, when we're talking about gender affirmation, we're really focusing on resilience, coping, and wellness. In terms of prevalence, gender is, trans or gender non-binary identities are a little bit, hard to study because, in order to gain information about how many people identify as transgender or non-binary, we have to have people feel comfortable to openly tell us this. Current estimates are about 0.6% of adults in the United States identify as transgender, which is about 1.4 million Americans. And this is adults. It did vary, reporting varied across states, with California having the second highest rate of 0.76% of adults describing their identity as transgender, their gender as transgender. The data does show that there's an inverse correlation with age. So this study, which was done with the Williams Institute, actually looked at breakdowns in the adults that reported, and the younger subsets reported higher rates and the older subsets reported lower rates. So I think as we are seeing gender being something that's more, gender and gender diversity as being something that's more openly talked about and more becoming a bit more accepted, younger folks are feeling more comfortable maybe being out as transgender, whereas, for older individuals growing up in a time where it was not acceptable, they may not be as comfortable being out. The other studies here are some different studies that have looked at rates in students. So middle school, high school students in different areas of the country, as well as New Zealand. And here you can see again that the rates of students identifying as transgender or non-binary are higher than the adult number of 0.6%. Typically around 1 to 1.5%, with some numbers as high as 2.7%. And actually, even if we think about just that 0.6% number in terms of prevalence, if we look at the CVUSD district, which Megan thankfully shared with me, has 17,614 students enrolled as of November. That would mean 105 to 106 of the students in CVUSD currently identify as transgender or non-binary, which I think is an extremely conservative estimate, actually. So yes, this is not just 1 or 2 students that we're talking about, it's likely very many. And then factors that affect this data, I already mentioned kind of comfort, kind of self-disclosing your gender. So stigma matters, safety matters, but also literacy. So understanding gender diversity. There's many individuals I work with who it may be, high school, college, adulthood where they learn about different gender identities and then realize that feeling that they've had for a very long time actually has a term that goes along with it. So feeling like their gender just didn't fit. So I think that's something important as we consider, and something to think about as, you know, parents in this community, providers in this community, educators in this community, that, you know, one of the reasons exposure is important is to increase literacy around gender diversity.
And can we back up just one slide really quick? We had a question come in,
Yeah.
just before this one.
Uh-huh.
So when you talk about no gender or expression is pathological, can you define pathological, what it is in that context?
Yeah, so there's nothing inherently wrong or problematic or, you know, incorrect about any certain gender, right? I guess one way to think about it is, you know, we know that, homosexuality used to be in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is what mental health providers use to diagnose different conditions. So, you know, homosexuality was there alongside, anxiety disorders. So something that we think of as problematic and needs to be fixed. Homosexuality has now been removed. We'll talk about gender dysphoria is still there, but the idea that there is not something inherently problematic or something that needs to be fixed about any sort of gender expression.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. All right. So when we talk about, as I've kind of alluded a little bit already, you know, when we talk about sex and we talk about gender, it's not very straightforward. We know that gender is really vast and diverse. There's a lot of different genders people may have. We know that everyone's experience of gender is different. And we know that gender and expression are always evolving. You know, I think the most important thing to walk away, one of the most important things to walk away from this talk and understand is that, you know, someone has an assigned sex, which is kind of what their birth certificate says, when they're born. Then, you know, a person has their gender, which is how they identify. Then they have their gender expression, which is how they present themselves to the world. And then they have their sexual orientation, right, which is entirely separate, but another, you know, part of a person, which is who they may be attracted to. And all of those things are different, and they're each different components of a person, or how they present or identify. And, you know, we intertwine them, you know, more than they really are, right? So I think it's important just to separate those things and to know that they're unique constructs. All right, so I've kind of set up a lot of the remainder of my talk to kind of answer common questions that I get from parents, from, you know, other providers that I work with. And then to kind of go over some of the core content. So you'll see a question posed and then kind of some data or you know, slides to kind of answer or address that question or concern. Okay. So a really common question I get is, my child's only 4. Isn't that too young for them to know their gender? And, you know, when we look at gender identity development, we know that beginning in infancy, kids start to get messages about gender from the adults in their world. You know, we know that actually even before kids are born, if parents learn the sex of their baby, they start to talk about their baby differently. People make assumptions about their baby just based off of the sex that they sex of the baby that they think they're having. So I think, you know, starting at a very young age, kids start to be influenced by the individuals around them. By 18 to 24 months, you know, kids are able to start to define gender and start to, you know, label. You're starting to be able to kind of understand gender and start to recognize patterns, right? So they notice if there's certain things that, you know, maybe the girls in their house tend to do, the boys in their house tend to do. And this comes about because kids are seeking a way to understand. One, we seek to identify things in patterns, but we also understand group belonging. And that's part of being securely attached. This is something we do want kids to do, right? We want them to feel like they fit in or they belong. So they're seeking to understand and make sense of the world by kind of classifying things. Age 3 to 4, children become increasingly focused on differences. And kids will begin to think about things as things that are girl things or things that are boy things based on certain attributes. And it's around this age that kids can tell you, I'm a girl or I'm a boy. And we do see kids this young who are able to start to recognize an incongruence between the sex they were assigned at birth and the gender that they and their gender. So 3 to 4, we become increasingly aware of these differences. And then as we get around 5 or 6, become really rigid in how we think about things. And we become more aware of kind of the rules and also the pressure to comply with them. So one thing I like to mention to people is, age 5 or 6, kids are really focused on this is what I should do and why, and are pretty rigid in rule following in that regard. And yet, if a kid is telling you that they want to do things that aren't typical of what we would think of a kid of their assigned sex doing, they likely know that that's not like normal or typical of a kid of their sex. And yet, if they're telling you that's what they want or need to do, it's something to listen to. The persistence in that and conveying that information to you, despite likely being aware of how that's going contrary to the expectations or rules, or maybe even despite getting negative reactions from other people, whether it's peers or adults in their life, demonstrates the strength of those feelings. And again, just highlighted something that's important we listen to. And then gender rigidity does tend to decline with age. Then kids, I think, are able, as we get older and older, to be able to see a little bit more space to explore and express themselves.
Awesome. We it applies to this slide. We have a question from Jamie, and her question is that her child is currently in that rigid thinking around gender. Mm-hmm. Everything and everyone is assigned. She wants to know, how can she help change the dialogue around identifying everything as girl and boy? So in that regard.
Yeah, great, Jamie. Thank you. Great question. I mean, I think as much as, and this will be kind of a theme, I think, as we go along today, will be to talk about how we can model, talking about things, more broadly. And if a kid says, oh, I can't play with that, like that's a boy's toy, then just to say toys are toys, all toys are for all kids, and whatever you want to play with is great. I think, things we can do is having a variety of toys in our household, no matter the sex of the kids that may be in our house. I think when those situations pop up and a kid says something like that, that's a great teaching moment to say, that's actually not true. All kids, can play with all toys. And, if you have an example of, when I was a kid, I really liked this or that or something, you can kind of model that as well. But using those as teachable moments is really great.
Great answer. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. So why does my child have gender dysphoria? When we're talking about gender dysphoria, we're talking about specifically the distress, which not all kids have to have dysphoria. I'm going to plant that seed now. Not all children need to have dysphoria, but dysphoria is the distress that arises from an incongruence or a difference between a kid's assigned sex and their gender. So a kid who doesn't feel like their gender matches their assigned sex at birth and then is distressed about it. So why does that happen? There's a lot of or there's research going on to look at various factors. Could it be genetic? Can it be hormonal? There's things looking at neuroanatomy. Transgender is different than intersex, but there's intersex can be youth who are born with ambiguous genitalia for a variety of reasons. But sometimes the research kind of gets lumped together a little bit, although they are a separate population, I should say. But there's a lot of, there's some research out there looking at these different things. And the answer is we're not sure, it's not clear cut, and we may not ever really have a clear answer. But I also propose, why, I sometimes wonder, why do we need to know why? I think it's better to think about this as diversity, and whatever the reason, we're presented with people in front of us and we want to treat them respectfully and appropriately. One thing we do know has been looked at and found not to be the cause are environmental factors, right? We know that it's not societal influences, it's not parenting influences. We know it's not due to adverse child experiences or trauma. The data shows that those do not cause gender incongruence. We know that gender diverse identities are seen in all cultures, in all countries, and all ethnicities. In fact, we know that gender diversity, there's documentations of like non-binary or gender diverse identities dating back to antiquity. So, I think that that's an important takeaway, is that so this isn't something new that society is causing. My 6-year-old child is assigned male at birth and prefers to wear dresses and play with the girls in his class. Does this mean my child is transgender? So here's, I think, a really good point to comment about gender variance in childhood, and making a distinction between gender expression and then true gender incongruence. So gender expression, we know kids can express themselves in a variety of ways with a variety of interests, whether that's toy interest, dress interest, peer interest. Just because a kid is engaging in behaviors that we would say are not kind of typical of a kid with that assigned sex does not mean that they have gender incongruence. They may, but they also may not. Gender incongruence, again, is really an identity phenomenon where we're talking about a person really knowing that their gender is different than their assigned sex and saying, this is about who I am. Sometimes we may see those early signs of gender incongruence in the behavioral observations that we make of the child, but that's not sufficient. But we pay attention to it, I should say. We know that here I mentioned that there's kind of, I mentioned before, like what age is too young for, at what age could a kid know that that they have gender incongruence? We actually know that the data shows that there's this subset of young kids, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, who, when they start to have language and they start to understand gender, start to tell you that their gender isn't aligning with their assigned sex. And that's one cohort of youth who show up to gender, like specialty clinics. But we also know that there's another subset, another cohort, which is around that pre-pubertal to pubertal timeframe, that teen or tween years. And that's another large subset of youth who come for care. And that often has to do with the onset of puberty. And as a kid's body is about to go through pubertal changes, or they're starting to learn about pubertal changes, when that's not lining up, that's when the increased awareness of the incongruence happens. And also often, not uncommonly, I should say, the distress or the dysphoria that then leads to kind of more outward signs of distress, which can then lead them to seeking care. So, it's not, we may see really young kids, but it's also not uncommon for it to be an adolescent who maybe is starting to talk about this for the first time, associated with some of those bodily changes that are happening.
And I think it's interesting too, because I know in our situation, it was for a period of time more the I want to be a girl at first,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that there was a sense of not having that correct language of really knowing how to express that next level of no, but I really am a girl. And so
Mm-hmm.
being able to kind of navigate those key terms and ways that your kids are trying to express themselves to you and listen and tune in and continue to listen is very, very helpful. It can definitely take place over time, and no two stories and no two situations are the same, which sometimes makes answering some of these questions a little bit more difficult, I'm sure, both for you and for me. I'm not a clinician, but I am a parent that these are the questions that I get too, and so it's quite a range.
No, absolutely. And I think the listening part, and the I want to be a girl, some of that has to do with, I think, also just that internalization of the rules, right? Like just, like because of how I'm kind of labeled, like these are things like, these are things I want to do, these are things that feel right for me to do, or the things I want to be, but I'm kind of constrained a little bit potentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. So as I mentioned, dysphoria is the distress that may accompany the incongruence between someone's experienced or expressed gender and their assigned gender, or their their assigned gender and their experienced gender. Gender dysphoria is the terminology that's currently used in the DSM, the diagnostic manual that I mentioned before. But I like to point out that the Endocrine Society guidelines, which are currently used to indicate some medical care that some individuals receive, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, the new standards of care that are in the works right now, and the ICD-11, which is kind of the international kind of diagnostic criteria set, all use the term gender incongruence, because they recognize, and I think we may see a shift in the DSM again, is that they recognize that, again, a person may not have distress a person may not experience distress, but may experience gender incongruence. And my hope is, right, the more we can affirm people and their gender identities, the less distress they may experience, while they can still have an incongruence. They can still say, this isn't who I am, and they can still work towards being more affirmed in their identity. But the distress itself is something I think we can prevent. My child is in elementary school and tells me they are a different gender than they were assigned at birth. Will I know if they will feel this way forever? So how do we know if this will their identity will persist? So we know that, there is to some degree kind of a dosage effect, right? The more insistent a kid is in in telling you that what their gender is, the more consistent, the more persistent. The current criteria for gender dysphoria, state that, a youth has to be talking about this gender incongruence for at least 6 months. Often the youth I interact with have been thinking about this for years. Earlier data that used some old diagnostic criteria when the DSM used something called gender identity disorder. If a youth met all, full criteria versus being sub-threshold, that was indicative of, again, their identity persisting. And onset or intensification during puberty, I think, is really important to be aware of. Because as I said, it may not be until puberty that a youth realizes, for a variety of reasons, that that they're transgender. But I think it's really important to listen to that youth in that time frame, and to take it seriously. Body dissatisfaction. So we know that individuals who persist with a transgender identity are more likely to have more body dissatisfaction, and particularly with kind of more gendered parts of our body, like chest or genitalia. And then again, as Megan pointed out, they may not always use the term, like they may not always talk about their identity versus a social role. But I think if you engage youth in conversations over time, you're going to hear more and more conversation about how they identify. and listening to that identity talk, I think, is really important. I'd like to comment here also on the, if you, on some of the data that's out there around retransitioning. You may also hear this talked about as desistance, right? And you'll hear people say 80% of transgender youth desist. So that data is based off of 2 clinics and 4 studies. One clinic in Amsterdam and 1 clinic in Toronto that followed youth longitudinally from younger childhood until later until adulthood, and what they or later childhood and adulthood, and they did report low persistence rates. If you look at their numbers, they said 2 to 27% of youth persist in their transgender identity. But there's a lot of limitations in those studies. There's a paper by Newhook that kind of really nicely goes through all these concerns. But one of the biggest ones I'd like to point out is, the Amsterdam clinic followed young youth, and they said any kid who didn't come back to their clinic later must have desisted. And I think it's just not good. It's a bias to assume that just because a kid didn't come back that they desisted in their identity. There's different ways to deal with missing data, and I think that was a big jump to make. Also, one thing is that the criteria that were used were gender identity disorder criteria from a previous DSM version that had a lot of behavioral criteria in it. And, as I just said, kids who may be showing kind of gender nonconforming behavior, or kind of, again, behaviors that we would think of are not typical for their sex, that doesn't mean that they are transgender. So I think that they had, a wide variety of kids, and, some of them may not have identified as trans later on. But I think that this number is, it's just, that number of 80% is just inaccurate, because they had such a wide array of youth that were studied, and it's just not ideal kind of measurement strategies. So not ideally designed studies, I should say. What was interesting is that retransition, or youth saying maybe I do identify more with my assigned sex, was more likely to occur in ages 10 to 13. And, I think things that are important to remember, or important to be thinking about, are talking with teens about, about puberty. And I think for some, really, again, this onset or intensification in puberty as being a strong predictor of that gender incongruence persisting. So something to listen to. And just really supporting youth around that age to explore their gender while there's, again, during this prepubertal time frame is really important. So basically, I think that the numbers, when we hear about 80% of youth desist, I think that's an incorrect number. I think that there's some clear measurement errors that existed. I think that, we know that the predictor of persistence that I mentioned before, this insistency, the consistence, a focus on kind of gendered body parts and distress in those areas, and then the onset or intensification of puberty is really what we want to be paying attention to in terms of, likelihood of their trans identity persisting into adulthood. All right. My 8-year-old child is assigned female at birth, refuses to wear dresses, asks to be called Max, and wants to line up with the boys for recess. What do I do? So here is where I think it's really important to start to think about affirming a kid in their gender and potentially considering a social transition, meaning a kid, presenting themselves in day-to-day life and as their gender, regardless of their assigned sex. So gender affirmation is really recognizing, accepting, and expressing one's gender. And there's a variety of ways to affirm someone's gender. It can be using the name that they ask you to use. It could be using the pronouns they ask you to use. It can be, helping them change their appearance in a way that aligns, that feels more comfortable to them. Some youth may choose to change their gender role, right? Maybe they're assigned female and they say, I want to live as a boy right now. And, I think that, that affirming that, listening to that and helping, explore that is really important. And we also know there's some good data to support doing that, which I'll get to. So let's see. Oh, I went backwards. All right. Sometimes parents say, I actually think it'd be better if I just try to get my kid to fit in. I want them to fit in with their cisgender peers. I think, so basically discouraging a kid from expressing their gender, talking about their gender with the goal of just fitting in and getting by. But we know that this can be perceived as rejection. It can lead to shame and can really lead to quite a lot of negative outcomes. Whereas, we know that youth who, let me take a step back. So we know that we know that if you look at adolescents and adults who identify as trans or non-binary or gender diverse, that you see elevated rates of all sorts of things, elevated rates of depression, anxiety, substance use, trauma, suicide attempts, completed suicides. We see higher rates of all of this, and that's alarming. It's concerning. What's promising is that there's now starting to be some data that have followed young transgender youth across, as they've grown up a little bit, and youth who were allowed to socially transition, so present as their gender, again, wear the clothes they want to wear, use the name they want to use. Youth who are allowed to socially transition demonstrate similar rates of depression and only slightly elevated rates of anxiety than same-age cisgender peers, compared to looking quite a bit worse off if they weren't allowed to socially transition. Similarly, studies that have looked at adults who were allowed to have different degrees of gender-affirming medical care, things like access to hormones, access to surgeries at age-appropriate times, show much, much better rates of psychological functioning and reduction of the dysphoria element compared to adults who were not given access to that care. So it's really, some of the current data that's coming out, particularly by Christina Olson, who is studying young transgender youth kind of longitudinally, is that supporting these youth at a young age in being themselves is protective, and again, keeps them from having a lot of these more negative outcomes. A couple of slides that highlight this. So this is from data from the Family Acceptance Project by Caitlin Ryan. And this looks broadly at like LGBTQ LGBTQ youths. And it looks at them rating how accepting the environment that they are in is. So, they rate their level of family acceptance, and then they rated how likely they thought that they would be a happy LGBT adult. And we can see that youth who have not at all accepting families, only about a third thought that they would be a happy adult. Whereas, over 90% from extremely accepting families believed that they would be a happy adult. Similarly, we know that, LGBTQ youth who are in rejecting families, I think it's have, it's like 8 or 10 times higher rates of suicide attempts than those from low rejecting families. So again, the environment that a person's in and the amount of acceptance that they receive is crucial, and is really essential for keeping these youths kind of safe. My child has always seemed comfortable with their birth assigned sex. It wasn't until they started hanging out with some trans kids at school that they told me they were trans. Is this just another adolescent phase? And so that's a comment, we get asked often. Families will come to us and say, gender was never anything that got talked about. My kid went to school, they met some other they met some trans kids. They got online, they met some trans kids online. Is this why they're trans? Like, is it the cool thing to do? Is it a phase? And this is where I like to introduce, or I like to acknowledge this term that's out there currently, which is called rapid onset gender dysphoria. This term was described by a psychologist at Brown University by the name of Lisa Littman in a paper that came out in August of 2018. And it was designed to describe the experience of gender dysphoria starting after the start of puberty. And she set out to study, her question was, is this a potential social contagion that's happening? And what she did is she went to 3 different websites where parents were talking about this concern of, this came out of the blue, what's happening? I feel like, I think this is a phase. And asked those parents their opinions. So found parents who already were concerned about this and only talked to them and didn't talk to the kids themselves. So some clear selection bias and measurement bias in the work. And what she found was that, 20% had a trans identified friend, more than a third had friend groups where more than half were trans identified. They had more social media use. They did have neurodevelopmental or psychiatric diagnoses, over half. About half had trauma preceding the onset of their dysphoria. And her conclusion was that gender dysphoria is a social coping mechanism for other disorders. When this study got published, there was a huge reaction from other researchers within who work with gender diversity, calling out a lot of the concerns about this study. We do know that, trans teens find other trans teens to be friends with. We look to find people who are like us to be our friends. And if we can't find them in real life, maybe because the environment we're in is not accepting and people aren't out, we go online because we're able to connect with all sorts of people all over the place. And we find people who are similar to ourselves. I kind of mentioned this before, but higher rates of different mental health conditions are unfortunately common in trans and gender diverse folks. But I think what we're starting to increasingly understand, it's because being a trans or gender diverse person in our society is not easy. Because we, as in general, are not very accepting or not very affirming. And it's hard. We're also kids, they're more vulnerable, so they're more likely to be victims of abuse. So I think that, all the things she found are not untrue, but her interpretation of why, I think, is kind of misconstrued. There's actually a really, really nice op-ed in the Los Angeles Times that was published July of 2019 by a pediatrician at Cedars-Sinai by the name of Paria Hisori. And she has a transgender daughter who came out to her in adolescence. And she's not actually written a book about it, but in the article, she says, my daughter did have signs of being transgender. I just wasn't properly trained to recognize them. Even as a pediatrician, she recognized kind of the shortcomings of just what she didn't know and what she didn't realize. And had actually a lot of these same concerns about why her daughter's identity couldn't be what it was until she realized it was. It's a nice personal account from a parent that I think is worth a look.
It was a fantastic book. I actually, I would show it. I know it's on a slide later, but I gave it to someone else recently because it's just one of those that I think it's just such a great read to really understand. And I love that she was just so vulnerable in saying that, we as parents are, so concerned with making sure that our kids' needs are met. And a lot of times we miss things and we miss certain things, and we're human. So this is why I think these kinds of things are so important, because it helps kind of give those notices and signs of what to look for. And there's actually two questions in regards to that last slide that I'd like to ask before we go ahead. And someone anonymously asked, we know that depression and suicide are disproportionately high for LGBTQ plus youth. What might some warning signs adults should be aware of, and what might they do if they notice them?
Oh, great. Wonderful question. I think what I always tell parents, loved ones is, any clear signs of changes in your child, right? If they do seem more withdrawn, if they seem more down, if you're noticing changes in their behavior in terms of less self-care, like not bathing, not, showering, that was repetitive, showering, not eating, grades declining, less interest engaging with peers. Those are all things to be kind of, I think, more worried about, and would be a reason to kind of, try to check in with your youth, but also maybe get a professional involved or school counselor or something like that. But a marked change in your kid's behavior would be one of the things I would do. And then what you can do about it. Obviously in any emergency situation, you always would call 911 or bring your child to an emergency department. I think, but getting a professional involved with a mental health provider, any type of mental health provider, I think is a good place to start, because they can help tease apart what might be going on and how to help.
Great. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, were those I thought.
Oh, yeah.
Was there any other?
Sorry, someone actually emailed me this other one. I was like, it's not in front of my face. So someone said that her child was recently found to have an excessive amount of testosterone. She was assigned female at birth. It's 5 times normal for a female and 2 times that of a male, I guess is what she's saying. So can this have an effect on gender dysphoria or be a reason for feeling non-binary? I know you're not a medical doctor, but
I was going to say, the true answer is I don't know. I think that, I don't know. I think that, anytime, I guess I don't know. I think that would be a great question for the kid's primary care provider, but I'm always cautious between, saying, if this is the explanation, then I don't want to invalidate a person's gender, right? If they tell you they identify as boy or girl or something else, I listen to that. I'm a little wary about saying, oh, well, if you have this, then that explains away or takes away from a person's identity.
Sure.
But I would say if you have concerns about your kid's hormone levels, that's a great thing to go to your primary care provider, who might then send you to an endocrinologist or something. And then if there's questions about gender, talking about the interaction, if there is anyone, but you're still going to want to affirm and support your kid.
Of course.
No matter the reason. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good question. Yeah. All right. I feel overwhelmed by all of this. I want to support my child, but I'm not ready to make any decisions that could be permanent. What can I do? My biggest message is the importance of support, and support coming in terms of affirming a kid's identity, being there for them, just demonstrating that you care. We know that, there's a lot of different areas of support that a person can experience, right? There's peer support, school support, support from other providers in their life, workplace for adults and maybe, later adolescents. Access to gender affirming care is a part of it that I think can be really important, and access to healthcare in general. So I think most importantly, I think we want to be thinking about what are the ways in which we can support our youth. An incredibly very basic one is the use of pronouns. It's an incredibly important way to respect someone and create an inclusive environment. We know that, it's not hard. And actually, I actually apologize because I usually start off my presentations by saying my pronouns are she and her, and I did not today.
I didn't either.
But that's actually, but it's a great, and part of that is because I have cisgender privilege, right? So I don't have to be concerned that you're going to assume my gender is something other than it is, because I identify with my assigned sex. So, it just demonstrates that, we should never make assumptions, and I should have introduced myself with my pronouns. So, I think, it's great practice to get in the habit of introducing yourself with your pronouns, to ask people what pronouns do you want me to use for you, and respect that. Sometimes people get hung up on those they, them pronouns, those neutral pronouns. We actually know that singular pronouns have been around since 1375. They are not new, and they are grammatically correct. You can look it up in Merriam-Webster, and it's incredibly important to use them if that's what a person goes by. If you need some help, there's a quick and easy guide to they, them pronouns, which is really nice. But there's also some other resources here about, one, you can practice with pronouns. It actually kind of gives you sentences and you have to enter the pronouns. But then there's some other articles about why it's important to use a person's pronouns and respect them. So putting them in your subject line, things like that, it's very important. And to highlight just how important they are, so this data is actually from the Trevor Project's recent data collection of over 400,000 LGBTQ identified youth. And this data here is particularly about pronoun use. And it says transgender and non-binary youth who report having their pronouns respected by all or most of the people in their lives attempted suicide at half the rate of those who did not have their pronoun respected. So that top graph shows that, if in all or most settings, a youth has their pronouns respected, the percentage of youth who attempted suicide were 12%, which jumped up to 28% if none of the, people, if none of their settings in their life use their pronouns. And then the circle graph here was really shows that only 20% of these of the transgender youth said that their pronouns were respected in all or most settings. Okay. 7% said none. Another third said few. Okay. And we also know that, again, trans youth in particular are more likely to attempt suicide, with about half of trans and non-binary youth having attempted suicide compared to a third of cisgender youth. Still LGBTQ cisgender youth. For those of us who are parents or, childcare providers or educators, things we can do are just offering a wider range of books, toys, games that expose youth to gender diversity. For play, allowing all kids to access all different types of dramatic play and allow them to explore gender roles. Avoiding assuming certain kids will not be interested in a specific activity typically associated with a certain gender. Using inclusive language, right? Saying children, saying youth, saying folks, instead of boys and girls. Avoiding gendered activities, right? So having girls and boys line up, right? What about that kid who doesn't feel like either, right? then they feel uncomfortable, then they feel outed, not necessarily outed, but they feel excluded. And I mentioned before, kind of responding to questions or comments about like, why is so-and-so doing this or doing that, right? You can just say clothes are clothes, and he likes to wear the clothes he feels comfortable in. For maybe a kid who's displaying, you know, an interest in different, you know, different clothes than you might assume. These are just a few of the many great examples that are out there for literature on gender diversity for young kids. And, you know, one of the most simple is, you know, the Red, a Crayon story doesn't even explicitly talk about gender. It just talks about a person trying to conform and doing something the way other people expect them to do it and it not working. And then when they were themselves, it worked. So, you know, I think to then being, you know, more explicit about gender diversity in some of these other examples. Same as Pink Goes for Boys just talks about how there's no such thing as, you know, certain colors for girls and certain colors for boys. Colors are colors. And then some of the other ones are more explicitly about transgender youth. I already mentioned ungendering language, but I think it's something important to keep in mind, just the words that we use. And avoiding, you know, I think the thing that I still get caught up on so often is I still say, you know, hi guys or bye guys. And I'm really trying to change that. I'm trying to say, you know, hi everybody, bye everybody. You know, I know some people have adopted y'all. I'm a Northeasterner at heart. It's a little, I'm trying, but I guess that just doesn't roll off my tongue quite as easily. I'm working on it. Folks, you know, I say folks most of the time now. So I think good thing to think about, be intentional about, and practice. You have to practice. The they, them pronouns, you have to practice, but you can get the hang of it faster than you think. This was just, I actually took this graphic from a colleague, but I loved it so much. It just says, sorry, teacher, but where do the kids whose most salient identity isn't gender and instead self-identify as awesome line up? So again,
I love it.
So again, just thinking about, I mean, there's other ways to divide kids up for activities, right? It could be, you know, letter of their name, or, you know, there's other ways to avoid a kid feeling excluded. I've alluded to some of this other stuff too, but, you know, what else can we do? We can educate ourselves, learn about different identities, you know, get in the habit of asking about names and pronouns. It is important to be mindful of asking that when it is safe to do so. You know, if you think a kid might use pronouns that are different than maybe you might assume, you know, making sure it's in a safe environment when you ask them of that. Also, I think asking them in what, you know, if they do say that they use a different pronoun or a different name, asking in what settings it's okay to use that name. You know, a kid may use one name at school, but may use a different name at home or at certain, you know, in certain other settings. And it's important to keep that in mind and keep safety in mind for that person. Use the same terms as the person you are speaking with, right? Someone may say, I'm gender fluid, I'm not non-binary, and you stick with gender fluid. If you're uncertain, ask, but don't ask questions out of curiosity, only ask what you need to know. Create inclusive spaces, including access to things like gender neutral bathrooms or gender neutral changing spaces. You know, we know that, you know, students, you know, really struggle with feeling like they have places that they feel safe. And, you know, feeling like they have, you know, that they can use a restroom that feels right to them or change in a place that feels right to them, again, really adds to their sense of safety, and is really what we need to be offering. And, you know, I'm often talking with families around how do we navigate, you know, how do we navigate talking with friends or talking with teachers about maybe a transition or things like that. And, you know, we always want to start with the kid and figure out what feels right to them and then help them be able to achieve that as much as possible. But I think it's really important that, you know, as adults working with these youth, we want to find the ways to support them. A great key for questions is, would you ask the same question of a cisgender person? right? Would you ever go up to a cisgender person and be like, hey, did you have that surgery? It's probably none of your business. Unless you're a medical provider or somebody else, you may need to know that. So I think that's just another rule to keep in mind. It's useful. And then to wrap up, I have kind of a handful of different resource slides. So these are different resources for families, but also providers. There's Gender Spectrum, there's PFLAG. There's actually a local chapter of PFLAG in Oak Park. There's the Family Acceptance Project that I mentioned earlier. Transforming Families, a local support group. And then the Trans Youth Handbook is actually relatively new and goes over different areas of different rights for transgender youth and covers things like documentation and access to medical care and rights in schools and things like that. And it's a nice go-to resource for information like that for families who might be supporting a youth in their transition. As I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, we do see higher rates of attempted suicides and death by suicides in this population. I think it's always important to know what resources are out there in kind of a crisis situation. The Trevor Project is specifically for LGBTQ youth and has a crisis hotline phone number, but they also have a chat option online and a text option. The Trans Lifeline is for gender diverse folks and is staffed by gender diverse folks. So individuals who, come from similar lived experiences. And then the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is, I think, the one we're probably most familiar with. But I have almost all of my youth and parents just kind of have these numbers in their phones, just in case. For providers or adults looking to learn more about gender diversity, or particularly supporting transgender youth, these are some books that I highly recommend. A couple are workbooks for helping maybe talk through gender with a youth. One's geared towards kids and one's towards teens. And then the WPATH standards of care, I kind of I mentioned earlier, but they are the guidelines put out by the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which kind of covers just what are the what do we need to do as providers in this field to provide kind of appropriate care, and goes through different areas. But it can be a good resource for transgender folks and family members to be familiar with, because some of the rules around accessing different types of care come from these standards. So they're good to be familiar with. And then lastly, luckily we are in Southern California. We do have a decent number of resources available. There are 2 youth programs that provide gender-affirming medical care to youth, which include the UCLA program that I am a part of, but also CHLA's program, the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. St. John's also has a program that is for at least adults. But then there's different programs. Transforming Family, I mentioned before, the LA LGBT Center, Colors, which provides free mental health therapy to LGBTQ youth, are some of them. And if there's any other resources anyone ever needs, always feel free to ask. I'm happy to help. All right, thank you.
All right. Thank you so
sorry I went long.
Yeah, no, this is great. And if you've held on and stayed with us, thank you. I want to thank you again all for spending time with us today as we explore gender. If you have any other questions or are looking to get involved, you can please go ahead and connect with any of us on any of our social media platforms or send us an email. Here we have Dr. Bernacki's information. I want to reiterate again that the appropriate slides for today that can be shared, I will share those with you via email. And as a reminder, our next town hall coming up will take place on Sunday, March 21st, and that's also going to be again at 4 p.m. That will be the dispelling of myths for gender ed K through 5. And as attendees of this town hall, you will have priority access to register for that one ahead of time. So check your email in the coming weeks as we get ready to send that out. And again, thank you for sharing your Sunday with us, and be well.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Take
you.
care.